When a man finally stops chasing and starts choosing himself, something shocking happens. The same modern woman who once acted unbothered suddenly feels threatened, exposed, and out of control, because nothing explodes a fragile ego faster than a man who refuses to be manipulated, impressed, or controlled, and that's exactly where the story begins. In today's social environment, a noticeable shift has taken place in the way many modern women perceive relationships and male behavior. With the rise of constant validation from social media, increased attention from multiple sources, and cultural messages that elevate them as inherently deserving, a sense of entitlement has grown stronger than ever. This entitlement is not necessarily rooted in arrogance, but often in conditioning. Years of being told that men should chase, pursue, insist, provide, and adjust, while women simply need to exist to receive. Over time, this programming forms a belief system where male compliance is not appreciated. It is expected as the default dynamic. This expectation of male compliance can be seen both subtly and openly. For instance, the assumption that a man should always be the first to reach out, apologize, or bend his standards to maintain harmony has become normal. Many modern women expect men to fit into predefined roles without questioning what they themselves bring to the dynamic. When the world repeatedly tells you that you are enough as you are, but tells men they must constantly improve, sacrifice, and prove, it creates a psychological imbalance that feeds entitlement. So when a man goes against that script, even gently, it feels like a violation rather than a personal boundary. Another layer to this entitlement is the abundance of male attention available at all times. A single post can collect hundreds of likes, compliments, or DMs, which reinforces the idea that men are always willing, always ready, and always eager to give validation. When validation becomes abundant, it loses value. Yet paradoxically, it still strengthens the belief that men exist to meet emotional or ego needs. If so many men are willing to comply instantly, then someone who refuses feels abnormal. The refusal is not processed as a neutral action, it is processed as defiance. This is why a simple no, a boundary, or a lack of reaction from a man can trigger strong emotional responses. Many modern women have not been trained to handle male resistance because they encounter it rarely. When most men respond with compliance, the one who doesn't becomes a threat to the belief system they operate from. That threat is uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and often alarming. Entitlement creates an internal narrative that says, he should want me, he should respond, he should give in. When reality contradicts that narrative, emotional conflict arises. Furthermore, the entitlement mindset pushes some women to assume that their presence alone is a form of contribution to a relationship. The idea that effort must be mutual becomes secondary to the belief that the man's role is to carry the emotional and psychological load. So when a man resists, he is not merely declining a situation, he is disrupting a mental framework. This disruption feels personal even when it isn't intended to be. It feels disrespectful even when it is meant as self-respect. And it feels like rejection even when the man is simply protecting his boundaries. Social narratives have also played a significant role. Messaging that emphasizes female empowerment but frames empowerment as dominance over men rather than growth within oneself creates a lens through which male disagreement or autonomy is perceived as wrongdoing. Empowerment should mean strength, self-awareness, and emotional maturity. However, when entitlement replaces true empowerment, the reaction becomes defensive, aggressive, or dismissive whenever a man does not conform. Male compliance becomes the expected currency of validation. When a man does not pay that currency, the internal balance feels disrupted. And because many modern women have been taught that men are replaceable and attention is unlimited, they often struggle to understand why a man would choose independence or standards over pleasing them. This confusion leads to emotional intensity, and the intensity is triggered not by the man himself, but by the collapse of the entitlement structure they rely on. In today's dating landscape, many modern women operate with a strong sense of social leverage. This leverage comes from the belief that they hold the upper hand in romantic dynamics, largely due to social validation, constant male attention, and the idea that men are always willing to pursue, provide, or please. When a man refuses them in any form, whether it's saying no, setting a boundary, or simply withdrawing his attention, it disrupts this internal sense of power. The refusal doesn't just feel like disagreement, it feels like a direct challenge to the ego they've built around their perceived influence over men. The modern woman's ego is often reinforced by the steady stream of affirmation she receives: compliments online, attention from strangers, quick validation from social platforms, and the abundance of male interest all work together to create a subconscious expectation. Men should be responsive to her desires. When a man instead chooses to detach, remain calm, or hold his ground, it creates an emotional conflict she has not prepared for. She is accustomed to men adjusting their behavior to please her, so the absence of compliance feels like an insult rather than an autonomous decision. Refusal forces her to confront the uncomfortable reality that she may not have as much influence over men as she assumed. And this is where ego steps in. Ego thrives on predictability and control. When someone behaves in a predictable way, especially in a way that aligns with her expectations, the ego remains comfortable. But when a man steps out of that predictable pattern by refusing her demands or emotional tactics, the ego experiences a sense of threat. That threat manifests as anger, frustration, confusion, or emotional outbursts. It's not just about him rejecting her, it's about him rejecting the power she believes she holds. Another significant factor is that many modern women have been conditioned to believe that their desirability alone should be enough to command compliance from men. They often receive attention effortlessly, and this forms the idea that a man's refusal must mean something is wrong with him, not with the dynamic. Instead of seeing refusal as a neutral boundary, they interpret it as a personal attack or a flaw in his character. This internal reaction comes from ego, because ego resists the idea that someone might simply choose not to be influenced by physical appearance or social charm. When a man refuses her, he breaks the pattern she relies on. And breaking a pattern always challenges the ego. It forces her to confront parts of herself she usually avoids: insecurities, entitlement, fear of losing control, or the possibility that she may not be as irreplaceable as she believes. The ego resists this kind of self-reflection, so instead of introspection, it chooses projection. She may label the man as rude, cold, disrespectful, or even emotionally unavailable as a way to protect her own self-image from being questioned. There is also the element of perceived social power. Modern women often assume that they are the ones who choose, not the ones who get chosen. They believe they dictate the pace, the direction, and the emotional tone of interactions. This belief is reinforced by society, which often positions men as desperate, eager, or willing to settle for any form of female attention. So when a man disrupts that narrative by rejecting certain behaviors or walking away entirely, it feels like a stripping away of social power. It shakes the sense of superiority that the modern dating environment encourages. The refusal challenges the assumption that men lack boundaries, standards, or self-respect. It forces her to realize that men can also choose, men can also walk away, and men can also refuse to tolerate emotional manipulation or entitlement. When a man exercises this power, the modern woman experiences a moment of disorientation because her ego is not used to encountering resistance. She expected submission, and instead she met sovereignty. This moment of ego disruption often becomes the trigger for emotional escalation, not because she genuinely cares about the man, but because she cannot accept losing influence. The refusal becomes a mirror that reflects her dependence on power, and the ego desperately tries to avoid looking at that reflection. When a man sets boundaries or begins to detach, it often triggers a range of emotional reactions in modern women, reactions that may appear exaggerated, confusing, or even explosive. This is because boundaries challenge the emotional patterns many women have grown accustomed to. They are used to men who overextend themselves, who chase relentlessly, who apologize quickly, and who tolerate behaviors that drain them. So when they encounter a man who chooses to say no, who protects his energy, or who simply refuses to play emotional games, it disrupts the dynamic they expect, and the emotional response is immediate. One of the first reactions is disbelief. Many women assume that men lack emotional strength or the confidence to walk away. They expect emotional compliance, so when a man calmly sets a boundary, it feels unexpected and even suspicious. Instead of interpreting the boundary as self-respect, they may see it as a mood, a tactic, or a punishment. This misunderstanding creates emotional tension because the woman is not used to interpreting male detachment as a normal, healthy act of self-preservation. The disbelief quickly shifts into insecurity. A boundary makes her question her influence, her desirability, and her control over the situation. When a man stops allowing certain behaviors or refuses to be available on demand, she may take it personally, even when it has nothing to do with her worth as a person. Detachment forces her to face parts of herself she often avoids. It exposes the gap between her expectations and the reality of the situation, and that emotional exposure creates anxiety. Insecurity is uncomfortable, so instead of sitting with it, many respond outwardly in ways that seem emotional or irrational. Following insecurity, frustration tends to arise. Women who are used to attention and emotional access often become frustrated when a man limits that access. She may feel entitled to his time, emotional energy, or validation. When he restricts these, she perceives it as unfair or disrespectful, even though he is simply prioritizing his boundaries. This frustration may show up as passive-aggressive comments, emotional withdrawal, or attempts to provoke a reaction. The purpose is not malicious. It is the ego trying to restore a sense of control after losing emotional ground. Another common reaction is anger. Boundaries can feel like rejection to someone who equates male attention with personal value. If she interprets his detachment through an emotional lens rather than a logical one, she may assume he is being cold, inconsiderate, or ungrateful. Anger becomes a defensive mechanism to protect herself from feeling vulnerable. It's much easier to be upset at a man for protecting his peace than to admit that his detachment reveals patterns that need self-reflection. The anger is not about him, it's about the discomfort his boundaries create within her. Some women respond with manipulation, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unconsciously. This can include guilt-tripping, emotional dramatics, or suddenly expressing exaggerated affection. The purpose is to pull him back into the dynamic where she feels more secure and emotionally dominant. This is not always malicious, it is often habitual. She has learned that emotional intensity can get men to soften, surrender, or compromise. So when those emotional tactics stop working, the internal panic grows and the reactions intensify. Confusion is another major reaction. A woman may not understand why her usual patterns are ineffective. She may question why the man is not responding the way other men have. This confusion stems from the collapse of predictable emotional scripts. She expected him to chase, instead he walked away. She expected him to explain himself, instead he stood firm. She expected him to soothe the situation, instead he remained steady. This breaks the emotional rhythm she relies on, creating disorientation and emotional overwhelm. Eventually, the emotional storm happens not because she dislikes boundaries, but because she was never taught how to handle them. She doesn't know how to respond when a man values his peace over her approval. She doesn't understand what it means when a man detaches not in anger, but in clarity. She reacts emotionally because boundaries force her to confront patterns, expectations, and insecurities she never expected to face. Scarcity has always held psychological power, especially in human relationships. When something becomes less available, the mind naturally assigns it more value. This principle applies strongly in modern dating dynamics, where most women are used to a high level of attention, availability, and emotional responsiveness from men. When a man does the opposite, when he becomes scarce, unavailable, or resistant, it creates a psychological tension that many women struggle to understand or control. This tension often manifests as obsession, frustration, or a sudden spike in emotional attachment. A major reason scarcity triggers such strong reactions is because it disrupts predictability. Modern women often assume they understand how men behave. Men chase, men persist, men pursue even when uninterested, and men provide validation without being asked. When a man does not behave according to these expectations, the woman experiences a mental interruption. She cannot predict him, and unpredictability naturally increases interest. The mind becomes more alert, more invested, and more engaged when it encounters inconsistency. The very resistance he shows becomes the source of fascination. Resistance also challenges her sense of desirability. If a woman has been socially trained to believe that men are always eager for her attention, a man who resists or does not immediately give in contradicts that belief. This contradiction creates an internal conflict. Why isn't he reacting like the others? What makes him different? What does he see that others don't? These questions increase mental engagement, which can easily turn into obsession. The desire is no longer for the man himself. It becomes a desire to understand the break in the pattern. Scarcity triggers competitiveness as well. When something is abundant, there is no urgency to secure it. But when something is limited, the mind automatically enters a competitive mode. Even if she was not deeply interested initially, the moment she senses distance or resistance, a competitive instinct can surface. She may begin to view his attention as a prize, not because she deeply values him, but because the situation now challenges her confidence and social power. The dynamic becomes less about connection and more about reclaiming emotional dominance. Another layer to this reaction is emotional ego. Scarcity threatens the ego because it signals that she may not have as much influence as she assumed. When a man is unaffected by her charm, beauty, or emotional tactics, it creates a wound to the ego. This wound intensifies the desire to prove something, not to him, but to herself. She may try harder, become emotionally louder, or attempt to regain control through behaviors she never needed to use before. The obsession builds because the ego cannot tolerate feeling powerless or disregarded. Resistance also activates the reward system in the brain. When validation is constant, it becomes dull, but when validation is rare, the brain interprets it as more meaningful. A single compliment from a resistant man can feel more valuable than 50 compliments from those who chase. This intermittent reward pattern is one of the strongest psychological hooks known. It creates emotional addiction because the mind becomes focused on earning the reward again, even if the pursuit becomes stressful or irrational. Scarcity and resistance also force self-reflection, something many people avoid. When a man pulls away, she is compelled to examine her behavior, her patterns, and sometimes her insecurities. This process is uncomfortable, and discomfort often turns into frustration. Instead of understanding the reason for his distance, she may fixate on regaining his attention, not realizing that the obsession is fueled by the internal imbalance his resistance created. In many cases, the frustration intensifies because resistance breaks the illusion of unlimited options. When most men are available and one is not, that one stands out as emotionally significant. His scarcity gives him weight. His no means more than the yes of countless others. This emotional contrast is powerful enough to shift her entire focus, drawing her into a cycle of heightened interest, confusion, and intensified pursuit. When a man decides to prioritize his self-respect instead of seeking validation from women, something significant happens inside the dynamics of any relationship or interaction. This shift is not only internal for the man, it creates a ripple effect that changes how the woman perceives him, reacts to him, and engages with him. Modern dating has conditioned many men to believe that their worth is tied to how much attention, approval, or affection they can get from women. So when a man breaks away from this pattern and chooses self-respect first, the entire emotional structure of the interaction transforms. One of the first psychological shifts occurs within the man himself. When he no longer chases approval, he becomes emotionally neutral. He does not overreact to rejection, nor does he overinvest in uncertain situations. This neutrality makes him more stable, calm, and grounded. And stability is something many women subconsciously look for but rarely encounter in a man who is validation seeking. The moment he stops trying to impress her, he begins to carry a different energy, one that communicates confidence, independence, and inner strength. This shift alone alters the dynamic because she can feel that he is no longer operating from a place of neediness. Another shift happens in how a woman interprets his behavior. When a man prioritizes validation, he becomes predictable. He texts immediately, apologizes excessively, gives too much, and tolerates too little respect. But when he prioritizes self-respect, he becomes unpredictable in a healthy way. He no longer responds out of fear of losing her. He responds based on his standards and emotional boundaries. This unpredictability does not come from playing games, it comes from having a backbone. And this change forces her to reassess her assumptions about him. She begins to see him as someone with emotional discipline rather than someone who can be controlled through attention or affection. A powerful psychological shift occurs in how she views his value. Men who chase validation appear lower value because they demonstrate that they are easily moved, easily swayed, and easily influenced by female approval. But when a man chooses self-respect, his value rises in her eyes because he is no longer emotionally dependent. Women naturally respect men who respect themselves. They may not always admit it openly, but the internal reaction is undeniable. A man with standards becomes more appealing because he requires a higher level of behavior, maturity, and consistency from the relationship. There is also an emotional shift in how she engages with him. When a man is validation seeking, she feels comfortable and often complacent, knowing he will tolerate almost anything to keep her attention. But when he prioritizes his peace and well-being, she becomes more conscious of how she behaves. She becomes more careful with her words, more intentional with her actions, and more aware of the consequences of disrespect. His self-respect forces her to rise to his level instead of expecting him to sink to hers. This shift improves the dynamic, not because he demands it verbally, but because he communicates it through his standards. Men who prioritize validation often attract women who are emotionally unstable, manipulative, or entitled because those women thrive on controlling men who lack boundaries. But when a man is rooted in self-respect, he naturally filters out partners who cannot meet his requirements. He becomes more selective, not out of arrogance, but out of emotional clarity. He no longer entertains chaos because chaos has nothing to offer him. This shift frees him from unhealthy cycles and attracts women who operate with awareness, accountability, and emotional maturity. On a deeper psychological level, when a man chooses self-respect, he detaches from outcomes. He no longer behaves in ways that seek approval or attention. He expresses himself honestly, walks away when necessary, and does not fear losing someone who does not value him. This detachment increases his power because it removes emotional desperation from the equation. The more he stands firm in his self-worth, the more the dynamic moves from imbalance to stability and from insecurity to clarity. When a man walks away, it triggers an emotional reaction that reveals far more than most women expect. It exposes the hidden dependencies, insecurities, and unresolved issues they have kept buried beneath confidence, independence, or entitlement. Walking away is one of the strongest actions a man can take because it removes the emotional safety net she assumed she had. And when that safety disappears, everything she has avoided confronting about herself quietly rises to the surface. One of the first things walking away exposes is emotional dependency. Many modern women prefer to believe they are independent and emotionally strong, yet the moment a man withdraws his presence, they experience anxiety, confusion, or panic. This is because emotional dependency is not always obvious. It doesn't always look like attachment or obsession. Sometimes it hides in the expectation that he will always be available, that he will always respond, or that he will always choose to stay no matter how she behaves. His departure removes the illusion of control she relied on, revealing how deeply she depended on his emotional reactions to feel secure. Walking away also exposes her reliance on validation. She may not have realized how much she counted on his attention, compliments, or admiration until it disappears. The absence of validation creates a sudden emptiness that she tries to fill through anger, questioning, or attempts to re-engage him. The need for validation is often stronger than the need for the relationship itself. It is not always him she misses, but the feeling of being desired. When that feeling is taken away, her emotional dependency becomes obvious even if she tries to mask it with pride or defensiveness. Another major exposure is the lack of accountability. Many women do not reflect on their actions until the consequences show up in a tangible form. As long as the man stays, tolerates, or forgives, she never feels the impact of her behavior. But when he walks away, she is forced to confront the role she played in pushing him to that point. Instead of acknowledging this, some women react with blame, deflection, or rewriting the narrative to avoid responsibility. Walking away creates a mirror she cannot escape, showing her the behaviors she never had to examine before. His absence also exposes how much she took him for granted. When someone is always present, their value becomes invisible. Many women assume the man's efforts, patience, and consistency will always be available. Walking away forces her to notice the emotional labor he silently provided. She begins to realize the stability he brought, the comfort he offered, and the support he gave. These realizations often come too late, but they reveal the gap between how much she expected and how little she acknowledged. Walking away uncovers her emotional patterns. It shows whether she deals with loss through anger, manipulation, avoidance, denial, or introspection. For some women, the first instinct is to attack the man's character, question his intentions, or accuse him of being weak or afraid. These reactions expose emotional immaturity and a lack of accountability. For others, walking away leads to self-reflection, but even that reflection highlights emotional wounds she has never addressed. Either way, the man's departure becomes a spotlight on her emotional landscape. It also exposes her expectations around power. When a man stays, no matter how she behaves, she feels she holds the upper hand. She assumes she can push boundaries, test limits, or undervalue him without facing consequences. Walking away removes that sense of power instantly. It shows her that influence is not guaranteed, that affection is not owed, and that no one is required to stay where they are not respected. This shift can be shocking because it dismantles the emotional hierarchy she believed existed. Walking away reveals whether her attachment was genuine connection or simply convenience. Some women only value a man when he is unavailable. They want the attention, not the man. They want the feeling of being chosen, not the commitment. When he leaves, the panic that follows exposes that the attraction was rooted in ego, not love. This exposure forces her to differentiate between emotional comfort and true emotional investment. In the end, walking away becomes a powerful psychological event because it tears down every illusion she built about herself, about him, and about the relationship dynamic she assumed she controlled.